Hi, I'm Kate from dailytarotgirl.com and welcome to my Tarot Meanings Deep Dive series, where we dive deeply into one major arcana card each week. So this week we're diving into the Wheel of Fortune. Now, the Wheel of Fortune is number 10 in the major arcana, and it's actually the halfway point. So we're halfway through the majors already. And because it's a 10, there is this sense of completion about it. It's like we're completing the first phase or the first stage of the major arcana cards. So I'm going to give you some keywords. I'm also going to be giving you some journaling questions, so you may want to have a pen and notebook handy. But I'm going to start by giving you some keywords. So some keywords for this card are change, cycles, ups and downs, good fortune, unpredictability, impermanence, and centering. Now there's a ton of symbols on this card. This is a very symbol heavy card. And I did a little research while I was preparing for this video on some of the symbols on this card because I actually didn't know what all of them meant. So I'm going to go into three or four of them. There's so many symbols on this card that I'm not going to go into all of them because I didn't feel like all the symbols it didn't necessarily help me understand the card better. So the main symbol on this card is the wheel. So if you look at this card, and the image that you're going to see on your screen is from the Universal Waite Tarot. And the main symbol is the wheel. Now the wheel also makes me think of a clock or even a compass. And there's a whole bunch of symbols on this wheel and letters. If you look at the letters, it spells tarot, so T-A-R-O, or depending on what letter you start with, it also spells rota, which is, I think it's Latin for wheel. And then there's some symbols of the elements and some Hebrew letters on the wheel as well. So then there's three other main symbols that I'm going to focus on. So there's the snake, which you can see is kind of slithering down, downward. Now the snake represents evil. Now snakes don't always represent evil, but in the context of this card, it does. And then there's the little red guy who looks kind of like a little demon, but he isn't. So he's a red guy with a jackal head, and he represents Hermanubis, which is a combination of Anubis and Hermes. And he is the guide of the soul, and he is a force of good, so he represents good. And what's interesting is if you look at this card, the snake is going downward and the little red guy, Hermanubis, is going upward. So that's how this card can symbolize good fortune or a change of luck, so things getting better. All right, and then we have the Sphinx who's sitting on top of the wheel, and the Sphinx represents wisdom. So the dark side of this card, all the tarot cards have a dark side, and the Wheel of Fortune is no exception. But the dark side of the Wheel of Fortune is not that dark, really. I often actually think of the Wheel of Fortune as being more of a neutral card. I think a lot of people think of it as a positive card, a good card, and it is good. There's lots of good things about the Wheel of Fortune, but I feel like it's more of a neutral card in a lot of ways. So the dark side of the Wheel of Fortune is mainly just that nothing lasts forever, so good times and good luck don't last forever. That's really as dark as it gets with the Wheel of Fortune. It can also represent history repeating itself as well. So I'm going to dive into three different things that this card represents. So I'll tell you what those three things are, then we're going to go into each of one of those things. I'm going to be giving you some journaling questions. So the three things are change, cycles, and centering. So it's easy to remember. They all start with C. Change, cycles, centering. So let's start with change. The Wheel of Fortune represents change, and it reminds us that everything is always in flux. Nothing stays the same forever. The nature of life is impermanence. Nothing lasts forever. Or as I've written here in my notes, nothing is ever forever. So impermanence doesn't necessarily mean meaninglessness, because sometimes I think we can think, oh, well, if everything is impermanent and, nothing lasts forever, what's the point? But impermanence doesn't necessarily mean pointlessness. It can actually mean the opposite. So think of it this way. So your current life situation, which is made up of your relationships, maybe the job that you have or don't have, or various limitations that you're experiencing, these all act as like a bunch of mini portals that will only be open for a limited time. And while those portals are open, so while your life circumstances are as they are, those portals act as opportunities to learn certain things, experience certain things, grow in a certain way. And those portals are only going to be open for a limited time, and then they close, and then other portals will open. But when we consider that everything is impermanent, it kind of makes us respect things a little bit more and really make the most of, wherever we're at in life right now, whatever we're experiencing. It just suddenly got super dark. The sun was out. I think the sun just went behind a cloud. Okay, so what was I saying there? Yeah, everything is impermanent, but let's use that sense of impermanence not to think, oh, nothing matters, everything's meaningless, but instead to really honor things and really make the most of things while we're experiencing them. So a couple of journaling questions I have for you. What is your relationship to change like? Are you the kind of person who resists change, or do you embrace it? And I know that will depend on the type of change, right? When was the last big change in your life? I want you to think about the last big change that you experienced. What was that like for you? Now, when you consider that everything is temporary, everything is impermanent, how does this affect how you live your life? And even just saying that to yourself, everything is impermanent, everything is temporary, how does that feel in your body? So when I say that, I get this immense sense of relief. I'm like, oh, nothing lasts forever. Everything's permanent, right? It's this sense of relief. But if I'm in a different mood and I say that to myself, I may actually feel a sense of anxiety, like, oh, nothing lasts forever. Like all the things that I love, everything that gives me a sense of stability and comfort and grounding in my life will one day all be gone. And that's it can be an anxiety producing thought sometimes. So just noticing what happens when you say that to yourself. Okay, let's dive into the next theme. So cycles. The Wheel of Fortune is all about cycles. So the nature of life is cyclical. Think about the cycles of the moon. Think about the rotation of the earth, the day-night cycle. Think about the seasons. Everything is cyclical. And there's always a time for prosperity and abundance and joy and well-being and peace. And there's times of lack and misery and struggle and pain. And of course, there's a lot of times that are in between those two things. Life in many ways is a series of ups and downs. But each cycle, each go round is an opportunity to learn something. It's an opportunity for wisdom and for growth. So a couple of questions I have for you are, I want you to think of a negative change that happened in your life that then led to a positive change. And vice versa. So think of a positive change that eventually gave way to a negative change. So an example in my own life, many years ago, a really horrible neighbor moved into the apartment next to me. And this guy was the neighbor from hell. And up until that point, we'd been fairly happy living there. And this guy moved in and he was awful. He was so awful. He was noisy, loud, a bunch of other things. And it was so horrible that we ended up leaving after a couple of years of that. Year and a half, we ended up leaving and moving to another place. And that other place was so much better, and both of us had, me and my husband, we both had, breakthroughs in our lives, and our lives just got so much better after we made that move. And that probably never would have happened if it wasn't for that horrible neighbor moving in next to us. So then an example of a positive change that turned to a negative change, I think anytime, like think about when you get a new pet, you adopt a pet, and that's a positive change. And you love that furry friend, furry creature. But then eventually your pet's going to pass away. So that will be a negative experience. Any positive experience we have, there's also the flip side, which is the loss of that thing or person or animal or experience. So I want you to think in your own life, what's a positive change that then gave way to a negative change, and a negative change that then gave way to a positive change. The other journaling question I have for you is, what cycles do you experience most prominently in your life right now? And what have you learned from these cycles? So I'll give you an example. So a cycle that I've noticed in my own life is the cycle of being inward focused and then being outward focused. So I'll go sort of long periods of time where I'll be very inward focused, and I won't really feel like socializing or going out. I won't really be that productive. I may spend a lot of time meditating and writing and reading and things like that. And then I will move into a phase where I'm really social. I want to get out and about. I really crave interaction. I'm very productive. I'm creative. That's where I will be super creative with making my videos and writing blog posts and things like that. And then I go back into that inward focus mode where I'm kind of low energy, not super productive. So that's a cycle that I've noticed that has always been in my life. And I learn a lot from that cycle, because the inward focus time, that's the time where I sort of gather wisdom and energy to share when I'm then in the outward focused cycle. And what I learn and gain when I'm in that outward focus cycle, I take it inward with me when I'm in my inward focus cycle. Okay, let's talk about centering, because this is my favorite topic when it comes to the Wheel of Fortune. So being centered within yourself is really the key to remaining calm and powerful amidst the chaos of life, during life's ups and downs. So if you look at the Wheel of Fortune, you look at that wheel and that turning round and around, which symbolizes life and the impermanence and the change of life. If we are centered on the outer edge of that wheel, so like basically picture like a Ferris wheel. If you're sitting in a Ferris wheel, as that wheel moves around and around and around, you're going to feel the ups and the downs much more intensely than if you were seated in the center of that wheel. So just pretend for a moment that that Ferris wheel has seating in the middle of the middle of the Ferris wheel. If you're seated in the middle, you'll be able to observe what's going on around you, the ups and the downs, but you won't actually be pulled along with that rotational movement. You won't be pulled along with the ups and the downs. You'll still observe it and kind of experience it to a certain degree, but you're not going to be experiencing it in a really intense way. So I think this is an interesting analogy, because if you're really centered within yourself and you're grounded in yourself, life's ups and downs aren't going to be as chaotic and intense for you than if you aren't centered within yourself. it's kind of like being in the eye of the storm. And this is how you can fully experience life and be present without being swept up in things. So, a question I have for you is, what helps you get centered? And what helps you stay centered? And actually, a better question is, what does being centered look like for you? What does it feel like to be centered? Because you might not know. Maybe you aren't often centered. Maybe you're an uncentered kind of person. If that's the case, if you're not really sure how it feels to be centered, think of someone that you know who you think is centered, who seems calm, collected, and centered. How do you think it feels to be them? And if you have had the experience of being centered, maybe you're a very centered person, what does that feel like to you? How do you know when you're pulled out of your center? What does it feel like to be uncentered versus centered? And what helps you get centered and stay centered? So for me, meditation is a big one because that helps me kind of quiet my mind. As long as my mind is active and it's hard for me to be really centered. Being centered for me is being like in my body. So paying attention to my 5 senses and what's happening, just doing like a 5 senses check-in for a minute really helps me get in my body and really center my energy. Another thing that helps me is journaling and writing. I like making lists of things I need to do. That helps me feel really, really centered and organized. Another thing I felt helpful is, I don't know if you've ever heard of Byron Katie and The Work. The Work is basically I think it's 4 questions, and it helps you kind of question your thoughts and question the story that you're telling yourself about something. So whenever I'm feeling ungrounded or upset about something, I'll do the work and I'll ask myself these 4 questions. And it's so helpful for just kind of grounding my energy and getting centered. So those are the things that help me, but I want you to think about what helps you and share with me in the comments below. What helps you get centered and stay centered? And just as important, what is it that pulls you out of your center? So I've noticed and this would be kind of like your emotional triggers perhaps. I've noticed that any kind of intense emotion has the ability to pull me out of my center. So when I'm feeling like really, really angry or scared, or even like really, really excited about something, I tend to notice that that's when I start to get pulled out of my center. And even like worrying or thinking too much about the past or the future, that's another thing that kind of pulls me out of my center. So think about this, like because the key to becoming centered and staying centered is really about having some awareness around the things that pull you out of your center. Okay, so to wrap things up, I want to talk a little bit about the wisdom of the Wheel of Fortune, because the Wheel of Fortune, like all the other major arcana cards, has so much wisdom to share with us. And the gift of wisdom that the Wheel of Fortune gives us is that change is constant, nothing is permanent. So make sure you find your center so that you can be in the world and experience it and be present without being consumed by life, without being totally consumed by the world. It reminds me of that phrase, to be in the world but not of it. It's kind of that same thing, Find your center so that you can be in the world and experience it without being consumed by it. And that is the wisdom of the Wheel of Fortune. So thank you so much for watching. You can find, I'll put a link to all of my deep dive series. I'll put a link to the YouTube playlist. There's also a page on my website where you can find all of my deep dive series, and I'm going to put Both those links in the description box below the video. So thank you so much for watching, and let me know, did you learn anything new about the Wheel of Fortune? And or did you learn anything new about yourself while you're watching this video? So thanks for watching, and I'm gonna take a little bit of a break until January, and then I'll be back with my deep dive video into Lady Justice.